December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest swallowed sound the way it swallowed men quietly. Completely. Snow clung to pine branches like shrouds, muffling the rumble of engines and the distant thunder of artillery. In the half-light of dawn, a column of German armor crept forward along an icy road, steel tracks grinding against frozen mud. Exhaust hung thick in the air. Frost-coated helmets. Breath came out in short, sharp clouds. Colonel Joachim Peiper stood in the lead vehicle, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the road ahead. He was one of the Reich's most aggressive commanders, a man forged in speed and violence, trusted with the sharpest tip of Germany's last offensive. The plan was simple, almost desperate: break through the American lines, race west, seize fuel depots, and keep moving before the enemy could react. Fuel. Everything came back to fuel. Without it, tanks were coffins. Trucks were scrap metal. Even victory itself stalled and died in the cold. Peiper knew the truth his superiors refused to speak out loud. Germany was bleeding resources faster than it could replace them. Every kilometer forward burned gasoline the Reich no longer had. Every delay tightened the noose. Speed was not just an advantage, it was survival. Then the impossible happened. Scouts returned first, breathless, eyes wide. Not enemy tanks. Not resistance. Something else. Peiper followed them off the road, boots crunching through snow until the forest opened into a clearing, and there it was, row after row of fuel drums. Trucks parked and abandoned. Tanks full. Tens of thousands of gallons of American gasoline, sitting in the open like a gift left behind by a careless giant. For a moment, no one spoke. German soldiers stepped forward slowly, almost reverently. Hands brushed cold steel. One man laughed short, disbelieving. Another dropped to his knees and pried open a drum. The sharp, unmistakable smell of fuel rose into the air like perfume. Engines roared back to life. Vehicles that had limped for days suddenly surged with power. This was it. The miracle they had been praying for, and yet something felt wrong. Peiper didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He stood still, staring at the endless lines of fuel, his brow tightening. This wasn't a hidden cache. This wasn't a desperate stash scraped together at the edge of the front. This was excess too much. Too casual. Too easily replaced. An enemy that could afford to leave this behind. An enemy that could lose this much and not collapse. Was not fighting the same war. Around him, his men cheered and refueled, unaware of the thought taking shape in their commander's mind. Peiper saw beyond the moment, beyond the roaring engines and renewed momentum. He imagined factories thousands of miles away, conveyor belts never stopping, oil flowing faster than armies could burn it. In the frozen Ardennes, surrounded by the very fuel that was meant to save him. Colonel Joachim Peiper felt a chill deeper than the winter air. For the first time, he wondered, quietly, dangerously, whether this discovery wasn't a victory at all, but proof that the war had already been decided. And as his column rolled forward once more, fueled by American gasoline, one question followed him into the snow-covered forest. What kind of enemy can afford to waste this much? And still keep fighting? By December 1944, the war had turned against Germany in ways no amount of propaganda could hide. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army pressed relentlessly westward, swallowing towns and entire divisions. In the south, Allied forces pushed through Italy, inch by bloody inch. And in the sky above the Reich, American bombers roared day and night, reducing factories, rail yards, and oil refineries to smoking ruins. Germany was running out of time. Fuel shortages were no longer an inconvenience, they were a death sentence. Tanks stood idle not because they were destroyed, but because their engines were dry. Pilots trained on bicycles instead of aircraft. Panzer units rationed movement down to the kilometer, calculating advances the way starving men counted crumbs, yet Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. In his mind, one bold strike could still shatter the enemy's will. One surprise could undo months of retreat. What he envisioned was not a slow recovery, but a miracle. The Ardennes offensive was that miracle, or so he believed. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. German forces would punch through the lightly defended Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and split the British and American armies in two. Antwerp would fall. Allied supply lines would collapse. The Western Allies, shocked and divided, would be forced to negotiate peace. But beneath the sweeping arrows on the map lay a fatal assumption: speed. The entire operation depended on outrunning reality. German units were expected to advance faster than the Allies could respond, fueled by supplies captured along the way. There wasn't enough gasoline stockpiled to complete the operation. Everyone in command knew that. The solution was as dangerous as it was simple: take it from the Americans. This turned fuel into the most valuable prize on the battlefield. More valuable than territory. More valuable than prisoners. Without it, even success would grind to a halt. That was where Joachim Peiper came in. Peiper's Kampftrupp was handpicked for the role of spearhead. Fast, aggressive, and ruthless, his unit was meant to carve a path straight through American lines, moving faster than command could react. He was given some of the Reich's best remaining tanks and armored vehicles, and orders that could not be misunderstood. No delays. No hesitation. Move west at all costs. But from the very first day, the plan began to bleed. Snow and fog grounded much of the Luftwaffe, robbing German columns of air cover while Allied aircraft waited impatiently for clear skies. Roads clogged with traffic, wrecked bridges forced detours, and American resistance, though disorganized at first, proved far stiffer than expected. Every obstacle burned fuel, every wrong turn drained it. Further, German crews watched their gauges fall with each passing hour. Drivers coasted downhill in neutral to save precious drops. Engines were shut off whenever possible, crews freezing inside steel hulls rather than waste gasoline on heat. Orders were barked, then contradicted. Maps were outdated. Radios failed, and still, Peiper pushed forward. He understood what few dared to say aloud: stopping was the same as dying. The moment his unit lost momentum, it would be swallowed by American numbers and firepower. The Americans could afford to pause, regroup, and counterattack. Germany could not. What set the two sides apart was no longer skill or courage. It was capacity. Across the lines, American commanders rerouted entire fuel convoys with a signature. Trains kept running. Tankers rolled day and night. If supplies were lost, they were replaced. If units stalled, reinforcements arrived. For the Germans, there were no reserves waiting behind the front. No hidden stockpiles. No second chance. This made Peiper's discovery of American fuel depots more than tactical luck. It was the lifeline the entire offensive depended on. Capturing gasoline wasn't just helpful. It was essential to keep the gamble alive. And yet, even as his men refueled and surged forward, Peiper felt the weight of the clock pressing down harder than enemy fire, because fuel won today would be burned tomorrow. Captured supplies bought hours, maybe days, but never certainty. The offensive was a race Germany could not slow down and could not win by speed alone. Every kilometer gained came at a cost that could never be repaid. Somewhere behind the cheering engines and renewed momentum, an invisible countdown continued. And as Peiper drove deeper into enemy territory, fueled by the very resources meant to destroy him, a silent question lingered, growing heavier with each mile. What happens when the stolen fuel runs out? And the enemy still has more? 2 days into the offensive, the weather still smothered the Ardennes in fog and snow, cloaking movement and distortion alike. Peiper's column pushed on through narrow forest roads, past burned-out American vehicles and hastily abandoned positions. Resistance came in flashes: rifle fire from tree lines, scattered roadblocks, startled soldiers who hadn't yet realized how deep the German spear had driven. Then the scouts signaled again. This time, there was no urgency in their gestures, no warning of danger, just confusion. Peiper dismounted and followed them across a frozen field. The snow thin enough to crunch, but thick enough to hide the ground beneath. Beyond a rise in the terrain, the road opened like a wound, and there it was, a fuel point, not a single truck. Not a hurried supply drop, but an entire logistics site, intact metal drums stacked in disciplined rows. Tankers parked nose to tail. Pumps upright, hoses frozen stiff where they had been left mid-use. Some engines were still warm, as if the Americans had vanished moments ago. No guards, no demolitions. No fires, just fuel quiet, waiting endless for several seconds. The forest held its breath, then sound came rushing back. German soldiers broke into motion, shouting, laughing, calling to one another. Helmets were pulled off, gloves discarded. Men rushed forward with cans, buckets, anything that could hold liquid. Drums were hammered open, fuel splashing onto snow that greedily soaked it up. The sharp smell of gasoline cut through the cold air, stinging the nose. Intoxicating, drivers waved their vehicles into line as if at a civilian petrol station. Engines coughed, then roared. Frozen machines came alive. Tanks pivoted their turrets. Half-tracks that had limped for kilometers surged with unexpected strength. For the men, it felt like resurrection. For days, they had measured every drop, driven with one eye on the road and the other on trembling gauges. Now suddenly, abundance. Real, tangible abundance. The kind they had nearly forgotten existed. Someone cracked a joke. Someone else called it a gift from heaven. Peiper did not join them. He walked slowly along the depot, boots sinking into fuel-stained snow, eyes moving from drum to drum, truck to truck. He took in the scale, the order, the calm efficiency, frozen in place. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't desperation. It was part of a system too big for the front line. Too methodical for an emergency supply. This was infrastructure. His mind began to do what it had been trained to do: calculate. Count, measure, not how much fuel they could take, but how much must exist for this much to be left behind. How many similar depots lay along the American lines? How easily this loss would be absorbed. The thought was uncomfortable. German soldiers worked like men possessed. Some filling one container after another, others simply standing there smiling, hands on hips, breathing in fumes like proof of life. A tank commander slapped the side of his vehicle and shouted that she'd make it to the Meuse after all. Peiper stopped beside one of the tankers, resting his gloved hand against the cold metal. Stenciled American markings stared back at him, clean and precise, like factory writing rather than battlefield scrawl. This hadn't been dragged here under fire. It had been delivered. Behind him, engines rose in number and volume. The clearing trembled with power restored. For a brief moment, it seemed like the gamble might work, that speed and luck and audacity had combined. Just long enough to turn the tables, but Peiper felt no relief. Only pressure. Because victory built on borrowed. Fuel was fragile, temporary, and this much fuel should have been missed. The Americans should have been scrambling to recover it, fighting desperately to deny it. They weren't. There was no counterattack. No panic. No all-consuming urgency racing to reclaim what had been lost, which meant one thing: they had more, much more. Peiper turned, scanning the silent tree line as if the answer might be written in the snow. The realization formed slowly, like ice spreading beneath the surface of water. The Americans were not fighting a war of survival here. They were fighting a war of capacity, of replacement, of output so vast it could absorb mistakes without consequence. Germany could seize fuel, steal it, burn it, but America could afford to lose it and keep coming. As his men finished refueling and the column prepared to move again, Peiper climbed back into his vehicle. The engines thundered with renewed strength, echoing through the forest. And yet, as the column rolled westward once more, he understood that speed alone would not decide the outcome, because you could not outrun a nation that produced war faster than you could destroy it. And for the first time since the offensive began, Joachim Peiper felt not hope but apprehension settle into his chest like the cold. Momentum has a sound. It is the steady rhythm of engines, the certainty in orders, the feeling that every mile forward brings something closer. For Joachim Peiper, that sound began to fade as his column pushed deeper into the Ardennes. The roads that had once been empty, arteries of advance, were now choked with traffic. Burned-out American vehicles blocked key intersections. Narrow forest lanes forced detours that twisted progress into crawling, fuel-hungry lines. Tanks idled longer than planned. Half-tracks waited, engines off. crews stamping their feet against the cold, while officers argued over maps that no longer matched reality above them. The sky began to change. For days, the weather had been Germany's quiet ally. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, giving Peiper freedom to move without fear from above. But winter clouds do not belong to anyone for long. By the second day, breaks appeared, patches of pale blue that felt more threatening than artillery. Then came the first distant drone. American fighter bombers circled cautiously at first, then with confidence. Roads once safe became death traps. Vehicles that moved too openly drew fire. Columns scattered instinctively, hugging tree lines, compressing into even tighter spaces that slowed everything further. Speed bled away, every delay cost fuel. Every stop burned time Germany did not possess. Peiper studied his maps in silence, the rumble of engines vibrating through the floor of his command vehicle. He replayed the calculus over and over. Distance remaining. Fuel on hand. Probable resistance. Likely air attacks, even with the captured gasoline. The margin was thin, dangerously thin, and then there was the American response. It was no longer the confused shock of the first day. Roadblocks stiffened. Artillery appeared more quickly. Units that should have been destroyed or scattered were somehow back in position, reinforced, reorganized. The enemy adjusted smoothly, as if setbacks were inconveniences rather than wounds. Peiper listened to radio reports filtering in from behind the lines. German units stalled for lack of fuel. Convoys lost to air attack. Requests denied not out of refusal but emptiness. There was nothing left to give. Improvisation had become a doctrine. Scavenging fuel from abandoned vehicles. Siphoning from wrecks. Capturing one American truck and stretching its contents across an entire company. This was not strategy. It was survival. At one halt, Peiper stepped out to stretch his legs, watching his men refuel from stolen drums. The process was slow and careful, every drop treated like blood. Containers were tilted precisely. Spills were curses, not accidents. He imagined the same scene on the American side. Convoys rerouted. Fuel replaced before anyone even knew it had been lost. Drivers perhaps irritated but never desperate. The scale was incomparable. A junior officer approached him cautiously, reporting another delay ahead. A blown bridge, American engineers already working on their side, retreating methodically. Peiper nodded, dismissed him, and stared out across the snowy road. The realization pressed harder now. No longer abstract, Germany was fighting with what it could scrape together. America was fighting with what it could produce. There was no clever maneuver that solved that problem. As daylight faded, the attacks from the air intensified. Gunfire tore through columns. A tanker exploded in a bloom of flame, the fire bright and obscene against the snow. Men scattered. Engines died. More fuel lost, gone forever in seconds. Peiper felt it then. Unmistakably, not defeat. Understanding. Capturing fuel had felt like seizing the future, like bending fate through audacity. But it wasn't altering the trajectory, only extending it. Borrowing time from an enemy who could afford infinite patience. Late that night, engines quieted across the forest as movement halted once more. Peiper sat alone, helmet off, listening to the wind move through trees heavy with snow. His breath clouded in the cold air, steady but tight. He thought of the Reich's factories, once roaring, now bombed into silence. Of oil fields lost, refineries shattered, supply lines broken beyond repair. He thought of how carefully every kilometer had to be earned on this offensive, and how casually the enemy replaced what was lost. For the first time, he allowed the full weight of it to settle. Fuel did not win wars by itself. Neither did courage or speed. Wars like this were decided by who could keep fighting after mistakes, after losses, after waste. And on that battlefield one measured in output, not bravery. Germany was already defeated. The advances ahead no longer felt like opportunities. They felt like postponements. When Peiper finally stood and gave the order to move again, it was with the grim clarity of a man who understood that every mile forward now carried an unspoken truth. The fuel they burned tonight could not be replaced. The enemy's Could, and somewhere beyond the next ridge. Beyond the next frozen road, the countdown continued silent, merciless toward a conclusion no amount of captured gasoline could prevent. By the fourth day, the Ardennes no longer felt like a corridor of advance. It felt like a trap that was slowly closing its jaws. Peiper's Kampfrupp was still moving, but no longer freely. What had once been a thrust now resembled a strain every motion resisted. American forces had recovered faster than any German planner had believed possible. Where there had been gaps, there were now lines. Where there had been confusion, there was coordination. And above all, there was pressure. The air attacks returned in full force as the skies cleared. Thunderbolt fighters prowled the roads with predatory patience, diving low, raking columns with fire before climbing back into the pale winter sky. Vehicles that moved during daylight paid in smoke and flame. Even captured American fuel became a liability. Tankers exploded like beacons, advertising their presence to every pilot above. Peiper ordered movement at night whenever possible. But darkness brought its own enemies. Narrow roads became bottlenecks. Wrecks piled atop wrecks. A single destroyed vehicle could halt an entire column for hours. Men slept beside idling engines, afraid to shut them down and risk being unable to restart in the cold. Fuel was still there. Drums still rolled. Tanks still carried enough to move, but movement itself was being taken away. Roads that had once pointed west began to fold inward. American units sealed off junctions with frightening efficiency. Bridges collapsed behind German columns, not by accident, but by design. Reports crackled over the radio, retreat routes compromised. Rear units under attack. Relief forces delayed, the spearhead was becoming a pocket. Peiper walked the length of his column one morning, snow crunching beneath his boots, taking in the faces of his men. They still obeyed, still saluted, still followed orders without hesitation, but their eyes had changed. Their early confidence was gone, replaced by calculation and quiet dread. Soldiers spoke less. Laughter had vanished entirely. Conversations, when they happened, circled the same unspoken question: how far in and how far out? Captured fuel drums were stacked beside the road like mocking monuments. More gasoline than many German units had ever seen at once. And yet vehicles sat idle nearby. Engines silent not for lack of fuel, but for lack of roads, time, and security. The irony was sharp enough to hurt. They were surrounded by abundance, yet starved of possibility. American forces, by contrast, seemed untouched by the very chaos choking the Germans. When roads closed, they took others. When units stalled, reinforcements arrived. Losses were absorbed, not mourned. The machine advanced with quiet inevitability. Peiper listened as reports confirmed what he already suspected. Friendly units meant to support his flanks were delayed or destroyed. Supplies from behind were not coming, not because they were intercepted, but because they no longer existed. There would be no relief. Standing by his command vehicle, Peiper unfolded his map once more. The route ahead looked thinner every hour. The route behind barely existed at all. What had been a daring thrust was now a narrowing corridor, packed with steel, fuel, and men who could go neither forward nor back without paying an impossible price. He gave calm orders. Redirected columns. Adjusted positions. His authority never wavered, but belief did, not his belief in command. Belief in purpose. The fuel they had captured had kept them alive long enough to understand the truth. That was its cruel gift. They could keep moving. They could fight. They could even break through one more line. But nothing they did would change the balance that surrounded them. This was not collapse by force. It was suffocation by scale. Night fell again, the cold deeper than before. Fires burned low, carefully rationed. Engines were shut down despite the risk. Silence settled over the forest, broken only by distant artillery and the occasional rumble of American armor moving freely where German machines could not. Peiper stood apart from the men, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Somewhere out there, the enemy prepared not with desperation, but with patience, with numbers, with replacements already on the way. For the first time, The mission no longer felt dangerous. It felt finished, and as the night tightened around his isolated force, Joachim Peiper understood that the fuel which once promised momentum had bought only one thing in the end: time enough to realize there was no path left to victory. Years later, long after the Ardennes had thawed and the war itself had ended, Joachim Peiper would return to that winter in his mind. Not to the gunfire or the explosions, but to the fuel. He would remember the smell of it cutting through the cold, the sight of row after row of American drums sitting in the snow, calm and untouched. The way abundance revealed itself not as celebration, but as certainty. In the moment, there had been no time to articulate it. Command leaves no room for philosophy when men are freezing and enemies are closing in. But the realization had formed all the same, quietly, irresistibly, and once it took shape, it never left him. Germany had not lost because its soldiers lacked courage. He had seen courage everywhere, men pressing forward with empty stomachs and failing engines, improvising solutions hour by hour. Nor had Germany lost for lack of tactical brilliance. The opening of the Ardennes offensive had proved that surprise and aggression were still possible, even late in the war. What Germany lacked was something deeper. Something no battlefield decision could fix. Capacity. In the aftermath of the war, Peiper spoke candidly about it. The words he would later be credited with carried no bitterness, only resignation. We could never win against a country that could afford to waste so much. It was not an exaggeration. It was an observation. What he had seen in the Ardennes was not carelessness, it was confidence backed by production. Fuel lost was fuel replaced. Trucks destroyed were trucks reordered. Aircraft shot down were aircraft rolled off assembly lines already running at full speed. Germany, by contrast, had been fighting on borrowed breath. Factories bombed. Oil fields gone. Rail lines shattered. Every loss was permanent. Every mistake fatal. The war, Peiper realized, had been decided long before his column rolled into the snow-covered forest. It had been decided in workshops, in refineries, in shipyards, and on assembly lines, thousands of miles from the front. The Ardennes offensive had not been a bid for victory, it had been a bid for time, and time was the one resource Germany no longer possessed. As Peiper reflected, the irony hardened. The very fuel that had prolonged his advance had also revealed its impossibility. Capture enough gasoline, and you could move for a day. Maybe two. But you could not outrun an enemy that produced fuel faster than you could burn it. Logistics, not valor, had drawn the borders of the possible for the men who fought under him. The realization came differently. Some understood it in the moment, watching American columns recover with mechanical precision. Others would only grasp it years later, when the stories of endless Allied production became undeniable. But for Peiper, the moment was fixed in place, standing among American fuel depots that felt less like a victory and more like a verdict. Germany had gambled everything on speed, surprise, and momentum. But momentum is meaningless when the other side can afford to stop, regroup, and continue without consequence. In that sense, the Battle of the Bulge was not Germany's last offensive. It was its final lesson. The war had become too big for individual brilliance to alter, too vast for courage alone to overcome, too industrial to be decided by daring thrusts through snow-covered forest. Peiper's realization was not unique, but it was rare in its clarity. Battles are won by men. Wars are won by systems. And Germany's system had already collapsed. As this understanding settled into place, it stripped the past of illusion. The fuel, the advance, the hope, none of it had been wasted effort, but none of it had ever been enough. The greatest weapon the Allies possessed was not the tank or the bombe, it was the ability to keep replacing them, and once that truth became visible, once it could no longer be unseen, the outcome of the war stopped being a matter of possibility and became a matter of time. A countdown that had already begun and was nearing its final days. By the end of December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had spent itself. What began as a thunderous gamble dissolved into retreat, encirclement, and slow collapse. Joachim Peiper's spearhead, once the symbol of Germany's last hope in the West, was forced to abandon its vehicles and withdraw on foot, leaving behind tanks, guns, and fuel it no longer had the means to protect. The failure was not sudden. It unfolded with the steady certainty of arithmetic. American forces pressed forward, methodical and relentless, not driven by desperation but by momentum that could not be exhausted. Supply lines reopened and expanded. Fresh units arrived daily. Losses were absorbed, corrected, replaced. What stalled another army merely delayed this one. The Battle of the Bulge did not end the war, but it erased any remaining illusion that Germany could still dictate its outcome. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated itself on an ever-growing scale. Across France, the Low Countries, and into Germany itself, Allied columns advanced with a consistency that felt less like conquest and more like inevitability. Cities fell. Rivers were crossed. Resistance slowed, then snapped. Behind every advancing unit stood an invisible force. Fuel, ammunition, food, vehicles, replacements flowing without pause. The fuel depots Peiper had captured became a symbol in hindsight. Not of German success, but of American excess so vast it could be left unguarded. A war economy so large that losing tens of thousands of gallons did not alter the front, the schedule, or the outcome. Germany had fought brilliantly, boldly in places, but brilliance without sustainability fades. Courage without renewal burns out. By contrast, the Allied war effort was not built on miracles. It was built on repetition, on factories that never slept, on decisions that prioritized endurance over spectacle, on the understanding that wars are not won by the boldest move, but by the side that can keep making moves after mistakes. Winter of 1944 marked the end of uncertainty. From that point forward, the outcome was no longer a question of if, but when. Many soldiers on the front lines did not know it yet. They still fought with urgency, fear, and hope. But the war had already crossed an invisible threshold, one defined not by territory, but by capacity. Joachim Peiper had seen it in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, standing among American fuel depots that felt less like a prize and more like a warning, because the moment Germany realized what it was truly up against was the moment the war was already lost.